Good morning, seniors. As we leave our exploration of Islam, I want to address a question that came up from several of you around extremist violence in Islam and why that violence. Here's a sad reality. In every religion, we find in the history of that religion small groups of extremists aligned with particular religions. Even today, currently in Myanmar, for instance, and recently in Sri Lanka, Buddhist extremist groups have been behind violence. In Myanmar, they're actually fomenting, encouraging ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslims in that country. Hindus and Muslims in Kashmir, between India and Pakistan, have been carrying out violent acts against each other for decades now. Muslims, of course, we know the groups ISIS, Boko Haram, Al Qaeda, and other extremist groups are really familiar with those. What most people aren't familiar with is how many Muslims are working to end these groups, and how many people do speak out, religious leaders and Muslims in just your everyday Muslims who are speaking out. What most people also don't know is that the percentage of Muslims who are killed and wounded by the actions of these Muslim extremist groups are in the 75% range. It's mostly Muslims who are being affected by these terrorist groups. We have Christians annihilating Muslims in Kosovo. In 1998, 1999, right before you were born, I have a friend who came and spoke to my class last semester, Flamur, whose family fled Kosovo during the Serbian Christian oppression, and he and his family were stopped at gunpoint at a checkpoint in Kosovo as they fled, and were nearly shot. And if it hadn't been for someone who recognized his father, another soldier, and called out his name, they would have been gunned down. So these were Christians annihilating Muslims. Of course, we've got Christians in the KKK. Today, you'll be hearing about the role that Christian crusaders from the Western Church in Rome turned on their fellow Christian crusaders who were aligned with the Eastern Church in Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. And this terror that the Western Christian crusaders brought on Constantinople was like the final straw in this really difficult relationship between the Eastern and Western Christian churches, and led to the first great. It was what led to the or the last step in the Great Schism, and you'll be hearing a little bit about that today. So why this violence? There are so many reasons, and they're so complex. It involves our personal psychology and our social psychology, our personal wounds and how we're responding to those wounds, how we act out of those wounds. There's historical trauma. Communities carry with them for decades, for centuries, for eons. People who have been oppressed for long periods of time. The Irish, who were occupied by Great Britain, England, for 5 centuries. And eventually you get the IRA and the bombings, and you get the British occupying militarily Ireland. This is historic trauma that gets passed on from generation to generation. We see the same thing when we look at the history of slavery in this country, which was supported by Christians and justified by Christians in this country. and the violence against the people from Africa who were brought here and their descendants born here on this continent by Christians. So we see this violence showing up in all religions and justified by all religions. Now, within the Quran, there is a just war criteria, if you will, that's spelled out. It's made very clear when violence can be used, and mostly it's in self-defense, and when it cannot be used. So when the people that you're fighting against pursue peace, ask for peace, and want to stop fighting, you have to stop. And so we can see that the ISIS and the Boko Haram and the Al Qaeda, they are violating the just wars that Allah spells out in the Quran. Within Christianity, there is no just war criteria in the scriptures, unlike the Quran. That just war criteria was established begins really being established in the 4th century by, 5th century by St. Augustine. And so currently, Christians use this just war criteria. Hopefully, they're applying it to every situation that calls for the military. It doesn't always get done, in my judgment. But it is something that's part of Christianity, because there's this acknowledgement that in this world of flawed human beings, there is going to be violence. In this war where people are carrying around their personal wounds, their collective wounds, their historical trauma, we're going to act out in violent ways. Many of the wisdom traditions tell us as well that this violence that we see in the world out there is a direct result of the violence that's occurring within our own hearts, within our own minds. That this is the reason that there is so much conflict, why there's extremist violence out there. It's because of what's happening within our own hearts and minds. Not only violent thoughts that we direct towards others, but the violent thoughts we direct towards ourselves. And I remember asking some of you in class, how many of you are really good at beating up yourself when you screw up or in your judgment you've made a mistake? I'm a master at it. This is the kind of violence that I do to myself, and as a result, I end up creating discord outside of myself. So the solution then is to deal with the violent thinking within our own minds and to come to peace, calm, and compassion. The last thing I want to share with you today is my own story of becoming a conscientious objector. I was raised in a conservative Catholic home by a father who was a 14-year veteran of the Navy. I came to see military service as a way for me to serve the United States, the country of my origin, the country I loved. And so I took an Air Force ROTC scholarship to Notre Dame. And even while I was in college, I was wrestling with my faith in Christianity, my Christian faith, my belief that Jesus was calling me to love and calling all Christians to embody love in the world, with this sense that we needed to protect our country against people who would harm us. In particular, at that time, it was the Soviet Union. This was still during the Cold War. But I was uncomfortable with it even then. I was really involved in justice efforts and volunteer work because I wanted to live out my faith in peaceful ways. But eventually, when I graduated, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force and was assigned to be a personnel officer. Here are a few photos of me from my military days. So this is me in boot camp, standing next to an F-15 fighter, and me getting ready to fly a T-38 trainer jet. And then this is my first wife and I up there, and people that I worked with. So I was assigned to K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It was a strategic air command base, which meant that there were nuclear weapons on our base that would be loaded onto the B-52 bombers. My first year, I lived just down the street, probably less than a mile from the nuclear weapons storage facility. Actually, it was the weapons storage facility because there were also conventional weapons stored there. It was an area that was surrounded by a couple of layers of fencing. At the top was the razor wire fencing, gun turrets at all four corners. And we were told when you first get on base, you get an orientation to the base. They told us, listen, don't even approach that fence, even in jest, because the police that are up there in those towers are trained to kill first, ask questions later. I would see these armored cars coming out in and out of the storage facility as I would drive by, and then there were these like little green grass-covered hillocks with a door in the front of the little hill, and that was where the nuclear bombs were stored. So this was the base I was on. While I was serving, I continued to wrestle with my own personal faith in a nonviolent Jesus, and asking myself, what should my response be? Did I really belong here? I wanted to work for peace. I wanted to bring about peace in the world, and I wasn't sure that being a military officer was the best way. I think it was my first year, I remember being in the office. You saw the one photo with all of my colleagues there. I was right where that photo was taken when a message came over the loudspeaker telling us that a couple of Air Force pilots had just bombed Libya in response to some violent action that had been backed by their president, Muammar Gaddafi. And I remember being really struck by the fact that I was wearing, in that moment, as I was listening to that message, I was wearing the exact same uniform that those pilots were when they bombed Tripoli that morning. And it really stunned me. My second year in the military, I was the Nuclear Weapons Personnel Reliability Program Officer. Big title. I was really only overseeing the work of the enlisted folks, including one of the experts in all of the Strategic Air Command, who would make sure that all of the people who worked directly with the nuclear weapons, including pilots and other bomber crew, were fit to be around nuclear weapons, that they didn't have a drinking problem or a drug problem or an anger management problem. We had to constantly look at these folks to make sure that they were safe around nuclear weapons. Eventually, long story short, I did decide that I could no longer serve in the military. I could not see Jesus with an M16 pointing at anyone, much less shooting it. And I certainly couldn't see Jesus using nuclear weapons to scare the hell out of enemies and try and keep peace by using these weapons of terror. Because that's what it was. We called it MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. And the idea was that we scared each other so much that we would not use the weapons against each other. But no one would put them down first. And I just concluded that that was inconsistent with what Jesus asked me to do as a disciple. So I decided I couldn't do it any longer. I took 8 months to discern whether or not I was making the right choice in resigning my commission. I didn't do it right away. I used that 8 months to pray, to meditate, to read, to educate myself, I had conversations with trusted people, including some other military members that I knew would not report me as I made this decision. And finally, I believe it was April 7th, 1987, I turned in my resignation paperwork. And I remember telling my parents about what I had done, and they thought I was dead wrong. And my parents are both really devoted Catholics. They thought I was dead wrong. My dad said, listen, I can go into the scriptures and find just as many passages to support the use of violence as you can finding passages that support nonviolence. I had a friend who was a bomber pilot who was a really devout Catholic, and he believed that if he was ordered to drop bombs on Moscow, that he could do that and be in alignment with his faith in God. So Christians disagree with each other about the use of violence. And this kind of disagreement is found in all different faiths, just like there are disagreements about LGBTQ issues, about the role of women, about all sorts of other justice issues. There are different interpretations of the sacred scriptures. This is what human beings do. And so I came to the conclusion that I had to leave. And lest I come across as some saintly person, some hero of nonviolence, let me tell you, there was a time when I'd been waiting for 6 months for the military to accept my resignation and let me go, and I broke. I couldn't wait any longer, and so I went into work one day, dressed in my civilian clothes. There's a really cool story around that I won't go into right now. But my boss told me, listen, if you insist on not working today and being in civilian clothes here, you will get thrown in the brig. You will get thrown in jail. So go home, think about it, and call me later this morning and tell me what your decision is. So I did go home, went back to bed, and when I woke up at mid-morning, I realized I was not ready to go to jail. Now, there's a part of me that still feels some shame around that. But that day, I was not ready to pay a really high price for my beliefs. Fortunately, within a couple of weeks, the military did accept my resignation, and I received an honorable discharge after over 2 years of award-winning service to the military. So I'm proud of the way I handled it. But that was my decision. And a lot of good Christian people in the military that I worked with and in my own household that I loved disagreed with me. So each one of us has to discern to the best of our ability how to respond to what's going on in our own mind and our own heart, and act in ways that we think are right. There are people who, in all of these different wisdom traditions, who act violently, sometimes because they think it's their last shot. No one's listening to them up until that point. Nothing they're trying is working, and so this is their last resort. So lots of reasons why people act violently, why they justify it in the name of their particular religion. And it often has more to do with our own personal psychology, social psychology, historical trauma, than it does with what the faith tradition says. Okay, so that's what I want to share with you. Take care of yourselves, and I miss you, and I love you.